Hi. Good morning to you. For me, it's lunchtime.
Good morning, Gülru.
Hi. You can hear me well, right?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh,
Tú, Virginia, me das paso a mí, ¿no? Entonces.
Sí. Ja tens
Vale.
el fons de pantalla, ja estem enregistrant.
Va, quan em diguis ja començo.
Comença.
Començo ja?
Sí.
Hello, welcome. My name is Antoni ABAT. Welcome again. We were yesterday. We started our winter school. We were discussing very interesting issues. Simply to remark some of the aspects we were.
It seems that you froze, Tony. Okay, so it appears that we are having issues. Let's wait a couple of minutes to see if our reconnect. He seems to be back. Are you there, Tony? Okay, so it seems that Tony is not being able to reconnect again. So maybe we can present today's speakers and the subjects
Virginia,
that we are.
sorry, I was disconnected. I just came back.
Yes, but okay, you missed Tony being out of the screen because he's having troubles with him. So I was explaining that maybe we can welcome you on board, and
Sure.
afterwards, Tony could be able to recap from yesterday's session. But I just wanted to mention. I just wanted to mention that today we are going to have discussions with you, Gülru, about the several disruptive elements, gender inequality to begin with, and then we will have talk about change and then trust with Juan. Due to the technical issues that Tony is having, maybe we can give the floor to you, Gülru. I don't know if you have a.
I think Antoni is trying to speak.
Okay.
Yes, finally.
Oh,
So,
you're back.
Well, I'm back. Yes. Well, apparently, I never went out. So it's So well, thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you very much, everybody. I apologize again for this horrible Wi-Fi conditions of my faculty. But apparently, it's something that it happens every day. So we need to get used about this. This is also questions of technology, right? So well, I want to
discuss digitalization tomorrow.
Yes. Well, this is one of the issues that probably we need to address. So, well, I thank you very much, all of you again, to be here. I was trying to do I did it at least 3 times. I don't know now if finally you're gonna guys listen to me, or I will be able to. I was doing a kind of very brief summary of what happened yesterday. We started doing a very basic introduction and discussion on the theoretical framework by my colleague Jorge Piñera and myself. Then we followed up with some of the we started to deal with the disruptive elements. Professor Jacob Waldestein was dealing with insecurity, and then Giuseppe Martinico was talking about populism. That's what we did yesterday, and today we're gonna jump into other disruptive elements. It's really a pleasure for me to have here Professor Gülru from Sabanci University. It's always, as I said, a pleasure and an honor to participate with her. She's a real expertise on gender inequality, and it's really an important asset and input for our project to have her on board and to be leading the work package on gender inequality. So it's going to be a really pleasure, as always, as I said, to listen to her. She will be start now after my words. Then we will have some questions to you, Gülru. We will follow up with Alberto Barrios, who is an Spaniard colleague, a compatriota who is in Denmark. He will be talking about climate change. He has been already before this meeting making some very interesting comments on the social contract, so it's going to be fun with him. And we will follow up with another colleague and another friend, I would say, despite that he's a Betis fan, who is Alejandro TIRADO. He's in Universidad Carlos III in Madrid, and he's an expert, a real expert on mistrust, and I'm sure it's going to be also very, very interesting and worth to listen to him about the elements of mistrust. So I don't want to abuse of my time. Please, Gülru, the floor is yours, and I hope that everything will work, at least in my phone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antoni. Thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the winter school in Virginia. I don't need slides, so let me see if people's cameras are on. I'll rather want to see your face and interact. So, well, as Antoni said, I am leading the gender inequality work package as part of the Sabanci University team at Sabanci University, Istanbul, Turkey. My name is Gülru GÖKER. I'm a political scientist and a scholar of gender studies. I am an associate professor of political science at Sabanci University. I work on gender and politics, gender equality, and deliberative democracy at large. Unfortunately, we don't have time for everyone to introduce themselves, but please do so if you raise your hand to say something, or if you want to contribute in chat. At least if you can, feel free to write your name and institution. Well, I'm assuming that most of you are law students, but I don't know for sure. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a legal person myself, but we'll see in the discussion whether we'll have any questions about that. So as I said, in EXPRESS² we're leading the work package on gender inequality, and we're going to address 3 questions as part of this. These are: what are the main de jure and de facto discrepancies in the European social contract with regard to gender equality norms? What similar and different forms do contemporary violations of gender equality take across Europe and also in specific contexts? And what and who are the counter-disruptive forces and strategies at the national and transnational level so that we promote building a more inclusive social contract in terms of gender equality? So we look at EU and non-EU perspectives, and we'll specifically, in this particular work package on gender, we'll specifically focus on 5 countries: Italy, Spain, Ireland, Hungary, and a non-EU country, Turkey, which is where I'm from. So, which is the context I know the best. So the European contract, social contract, has improved to a great extent by recognizing formal equality, right, when we think in terms of gender. And not just that, but also from moving from formal equality, equality before law, to substantive equality, meaning equality in outcomes, the actual exercise of power, and the eradication of deeply entrenched inequalities and barriers to women's full participation in social, economic, and political life, which necessitate things such as positive measures at women's inclusion in decision-making, but not just that, not just the representation of women in decision-making, but also the representation and the integration of a gender perspective into decision-making, which, is generally framed as gender mainstreaming of all policy areas. So that said, Although EU is most advanced in terms of gender equality when compared to some other parts of the world, there are concerning developments, particularly with regard to, and you talked about populism yesterday, with regard to far-right, populist right-wing parties rising in power, things such as reproductive rights coming under attack, LGBT plus rights coming under attack, pro-natalist policies, which we see sometimes in the form of new care policy arrangements, abandoning of foreign feminist perspectives in policymaking. If you think about the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women, well, that's the long name. The short name is the Istanbul Convention. Countries that have ratified the convention are deliberating whether to withdraw from it. A non-EU country, Turkey, where the convention is named after the Istanbul Convention, where I'm at now, has already withdrawn from the convention. On the other hand, though, we see gender-based violence increasingly directed towards women in politics, which is a disconcerting phenomena for some years now, and also widening in digital forms in the form of cyber attacks, hate speech, defamation, among others. So looking at the 2024 European election outcomes and the far-right parties, one affirms political scientist Sylvia Walby when she says, gender constitutes a high stake for democracy in the continent. And I quote from Walby now, she says, while the EU has been important in promoting gender equality, recent changes have raised questions as to the future. And despite the narrowing gender gap in decision-making in some EU institutions, Walby continues saying that gender equality no longer appears to be a strategic priority. This is from a January 2024 survey in Spain, which has revealed that while the majority of citizens still support gender policies, 44% of men and 32.5% of women think that the promotion of women's equality has gone a little too far and is now causing discrimination against men. So these are, general sentiments we see in many countries and across the world. So for some years now, anti-gender politics and democratic backsliding are reinforcing each other, and gender equality, as Lombardo and Cantola say it, has become a litmus test for the democratic health of Europe. But please feel free to write in chat, by the way. I don't see your faces, so it feels a bit weird as I'm speaking. I feel like I'm speaking to myself. But then there are also other disruptive forces that other scholars delve into in this winter school, such as climate change, which you'll talk about today, populism, which you talked about yesterday, the pandemic, the war and insecurity, which also have a lot to do with gender, right? Does anyone want to speak about it? What do these other disruptive elements have to do with gender? In what ways do you think they're gendered? If anyone wants to just raise a hand or write in chat, we can make it a more interactive discussion. Please feel free to intervene. So if we think that these other disruptive elements such as climate, war and insecurity, populism, the pandemic also have to do with gender, then where are gender perspectives in contract making is an important question, right? How can a more inclusive social contract be made? What challenges must be overcome to achieve gender equality in the 21st century? According to Regine Senac, the answer lies beyond the law. Equality before law, in other words, formal equality, is already achieved in roughly, let's say, the second half of the 20th century, both at the European level and at the national levels. But there's the enigma of what she calls the persistent inequalities. It's not just that the de jure and de facto situation do not match. I would also add that there are also concerning developments that overthrow existing hard-won rights and legal achievements. But then there are also persistent inequalities, right? Some of these sorts of inequalities that has been truly hard to overcome. What do you think? Which are some of these persistent inequalities when it comes to gender inequality? Do you have any examples? What would you say is very hard to overcome over the years? Anyone? Let me see.
I guess you could look at the gender pay gap. Yes,
that was first on my list as well. Right? The pay gap in EU women's gross hourly earnings. This is 2022 data. women's gross hourly earnings were on average 12.7% below those of men. In relation to it, I would add the gendered care labor, right? Again, from the same year, women bear primary responsibility for childcare. Alberto also said unpaired care work. Unpaired care, yes, women bear primary responsibility for childcare and are twice as likely to spend at least 5 hours on childcare per day than men. Another one I would say is gender-based violence. Based on the EU Gender-Based Violence Survey Wave 2021, around 50 million women aged from 18 to 74, that is roughly 31% of women experienced physical or sexual violence in adulthood, and data shows that home is not always a safe place for many women. Right? This 32% of this violence come from violent partners. And as I said, there's also this disconcerting phenomenon of violence against women in politics. As you know, in 2023, the Parliament passed the resolution of sexual harassment in the EU and the Me Too movement, and reiterated a concern for women politicians and advocates of women's rights as particularly exposed to online forms of violence and harassment. And you can see that, a lot of Horizon Europe projects are now also addressing that issue and trying to find, underlying causes, but also remedies. I would also add, looking across the world, underrepresentation in politics, victims of war and conflict. You talked about insecurity yesterday, right? And the issue of continuum of violence and gender-based violence within this topic. According to Interparliamentary Union data, as of January 2023, 11.3% of all countries had women heads of state. Close to 10% had women heads of government, and the global average of women MPs is 26%. So, a simple dichotomy between de jure equality and its application does not really help, because it avoids seeing the exclusions inherent in the Declaration of Equality before Law. So if we're talking about the social contract, we must pay attention to the origins of women's exclusion from citizenship in both its liberal and Republican traditions, I would say. In their original formulation, social contract theories rest on embedded assumptions about women's secondary status in social and political life, women's primary role defined in terms of social reproduction in the private sphere, hence the unpaid domestic work, and the gender division of labor that determines women's limited or no access at all to the public sphere, political and economic life. So the understanding was that men make laws, women make home, or if you're a Republican, women also make mores, right, social mores. According to Carol Pateman, the social contract is indeed a contract between free men that is simultaneously based on a sexual contracts that is promoting and perpetuating the systematic oppression of women in the private sphere and their limited access to the public sphere. So on one hand, freedom and justice is sought in the public sphere, but it has come historically at the expense of domination and injustice in the private sphere. So kings at home, equal brothers in public. So what have been some of the feminist strategies to overcome this, or strategies for equal citizenship? Since in this project as well, we'll focus on strategies to overcome these disruptions. I would say there is no single one, but there are different ones that sometimes overlap, and it depends on how the problem is defined and what the objective for transformation is. If you're familiar with our work, political scientist Judith Squires offers a typology of 3 different visions of gender equality. And these are the inclusion strategy, the reversal strategy, and the displacement strategy. If the ambition is to include women in a political from which they're currently excluded from, then you're talking about the inclusion strategy. Right? Politically, it's pretty straightforward. It corresponds to the liberal feminist tradition or of equality politics. The idea is that the system needs to be gender neutral in order to be just. Men and women are both human beings, so they should be treated the same. The law should not make any distinctions based on gender. It has to be neutral, is the basic idea. But over time, feminists and scholars realize that that might itself create certain injustices. So there is this ambition. If the ambition is to reconfigure a political by which women are currently oppressed, then we talk about a reversal strategy. Here, the ambition is to reconfigure the political such that it becomes more open to gender specificity, so not just neutrality, politically associated more with radical feminist traditions or different feminism or cultural feminism. So there are certain things that create injustice when you treat people the same, right? Gender neutrality might end up in gender blindness and create new inequalities, or avoid addressing deeply entrenched problems. Or think about in the case of maternity leaves, or like you gave the example, women's unequal share of care work. If you, I don't know, which level in your, career you are, or in terms of, whether you're grad students or undergrad students, but if you think about these, research applications like Marie Curie funds or ERC funds, usually one more year is added for women to the age limit, right? And that's because, the assumption is that women take on most of the care work. So it is to be fair, right? Being neutral in that scenario is sometimes being unfair. So this is the reversal strategy, looking at gender specificity. If the ambition is to displace this whole opposition between the two options, then we're talking about a more transformative strategy of displacement to destabilize the apparent opposition between inclusion and reversal strategies. So this time, the problem, the gendered world itself is the problem. So it's not that law treats different or the same, but the argument goes like this, politics, the law, whatever institution you're talking about is a patriarchal institution that must be transformed, and there are multiple intersecting inequalities is the idea here, because one is never just a woman, right? We have, multiple inequalities intersect to create problems. So roughly, we have seen all three strategies in the advancement of gender equality policy in the EU. The EU-level gender equality project is a set of goals, principles, laws, policies, institutions, mechanisms, and actors, which started as a legal principle for equal pay in the Treaty of Rome, and over time it has developed to be a much more complicated and far-reaching set of values and practices. Right? It includes descriptive and substantive representation, it includes equal treatment, it includes gender mainstreaming. So mostly in the 60s and 70s, the focus was on equal pay and equal treatment. In the 80s, more on equal opportunities. 90s was a time when parity democracy, so positive action and gender quotas were debated, right? So the focus was more on substantive equality and creating substantive opportunities for women and outcomes, and gender mainstreaming of policy. So this turn in the 90s towards substantive equality is critical for redressing underlying forms of discrimination and looking at structural underrepresentation. Scholars like Jaco interpret this transformation in EU gender policy from the Treaty of Rome to the post-Lisbon period as a market-driven trajectory of gender equality policy. And Jaco interprets the post-Lisbon period, or today very roughly, as a cognitive framework of European gender equality policy being destabilized against the backdrop of an economic and budgetary crisis. And equality becomes an objective that is not only subordinate, but truly secondary, even ancillary to the European project, is what she's concerned about. So here we are in the post-COVID period. You're also going to talk about the pandemic as a disruptive element. This is a period which some scholars define as a period of polycrises or multi-crises, like economic, political, ecological crises, and a period of uncertainty. So the question then becomes how to reframe egalitarian democracy in such a context, right? So if you think about a more inclusive social contract, which the EXPRESS project is trying to do. Some scholars in gender and politics answer the question as parity democracy. EXPRESS says, express to specify and protect the EU social contract, so a more balanced, more egalitarian gender representation and power sharing. Over the last 20 years, if we look at it, gender balance has improved in EU member states' parliaments, right, to a great extent. Evidence suggests that legislative quotas have positive impact on achieving gender balance in parliaments. Since 2004, the proportion of women MPs in countries with legislative candidate quotas doubled. The EU also now has a gender balance on corporate boards directive, which entered into application in the end of the last year for a more balanced gender representation on the boards of listed companies across EU member states. So you see, gender participation is not just a participation in the parliament. And the spread of quotas are important for two reasons relating to the story of trajectory from formal to substantive equality. One, for enhancing representation and inclusiveness of democratic institutions by fixing not just the aggregative deficiencies, but also deliberative deficiencies, which is crucial for our project. And also by two, overcoming the separation of spheres tradition to address systematic exclusion of women, not just in one political domain, but also for public authorities and decision making. If we think about it, decision making happens on many levels. I sometimes ask my students, why should women be equally represented? Like, I often ask this to them in my gender and politics class. It's a very simple question. But sometimes answering what looks like a very obvious question is, I think, important for seeing the different levels of the same problem. So why should women be equally represented? There are different justifications and different answers to this. And Phillips, for instance, political theorist, offers three broad arguments. One is the justice argument, the most compelling one, right? It's the normatively most powerful argument, that it's just grotesquely unfair for men to monopolize representation, because if there were no obstacles operating to keep certain groups of people out of political life, then the expectation would be that the positions would be randomly distributed, right, between genders. So there has to be some kind of injustice underlying this kind of distorted distribution, which is a case for action. Right? Mind you, there's no claim for substantive representation here. Another argument, well, I don't think it's as forceful, but it's a pragmatic argument stressing the electoral advantages of increasing numbers of women representatives, which of course depends on party ideology. It might not be an advantage in all situations. Then there are the difference arguments of two kinds. One, that women will bring a different style and approach to politics than men, as some people argue. Other is that women are themselves a heterogeneous group, so their diverse needs need to be reflected in decision making. Other arguments also exist, like in scholarship, showing the value of role models or symbolic arguments for making meaning, for recognition of disadvantaged groups. But there is something that gives the act of representation a value above all other political acts, which I think is related to the deliberative function of representation. And I think this emphasis is important for our project in thinking about inclusion in terms of social contract, right? Because inclusion is never just aggregation of different interests. Right? We're talking about also deliberating about these. So the interest argument, well, women have particular needs, interests, concerns, which will be inadequately addressed in a politics that is dominated by men, is the idea here. Okay, so women have distant interests in relation to childbearing. You already gave examples to that. In terms of exposure to sexual harassment and violence, the division of paid and unpaid labor, again, you gave example to it in persistent inequalities. Exclusion from economic and political power. But of course, then the question is, do you have to be a woman to represent this interest? But the more fixed the interest, the more definite and easily defined, the less significant is the act of representation, right? If you know what I want, if it's fixed, right? If it's X, Y, or Z, you can go to a meeting in my name and you can say, Gülru GÖKER wants X, and I'm, trusting you no matter who you are, right? That you're going to represent my fixed interest. But think of it in terms of disadvantaged groups, or think of it when the interest is not fixed, not articulated, maybe not even fully known in cases of epistemic injustice, right? So, or if, maybe it's known, but there's an issue of mistrust that comes from historical injustice for years. And in those cases, in one of the most influential, I would say, texts in gender and politics, Jane Mansbridge asks, where the name of the article, should blacks represent blacks and women represent women? Does anyone know her answer? Anyone familiar with this article? What's her answer? Should women represent women? Okay, her answer is a contingent yes. She says the primary function of representative democracy is to represent the substantive interests of the represented, both through deliberation and aggregation. We know what the aggregative function of politics is, right? It's just, adding up different interests. But the deliberative function of a representative body aims at understanding, which policies are good for society as a whole, which policies are good for the representative's constituents. What happens when these interests come into conflict, right? And it also aims to transform interests, right? Politics is itself a way of transformation, of articulation. So in its deliberative function, a representative body should ideally include at least one representative who can speak for every group that might provide new information, a new perspective, and new insights. And according to Jane Mansbridge, in at least 4 contexts, disadvantaged groups may want to be represented by a descriptive representative, which means people who look like them in terms of identity, who are like them, who represent their group. So what are these 4 contexts? 1, advocating communication in a context of mistrust. So, for instance, mistrust in man-made laws that always leave women out. Okay. When you need innovative thinking in the context of not fully articulated or uncrystallized interests, think of this conception of epistemic injustice, referring to those cases when a group's epistemic vocabulary and tools are not in place to formulate a certain experience as systematic experience. Before sexual harassment was coined as sexual harassment, right? It was hard to translate that experience to a form of structural injustice. So in these first 2, in case of mistrust and unfully articulated interests, you might want selective descriptive representation. And in that case, descriptive representation also improves the quality of deliberation. Other contexts she gives examples to are creation of social meaning for members of a group in case of historical injustice, and also creating de facto legitimacy in the context of past discrimination. In the second 2, the benefits and their goods are irrelevant from substantive representation. So, okay, so that's why more women's voice needed in the EU social contract. So coming back to what I said in the very beginning, I said we see a rise of populism and mistrust. We see it at the context of political but multiple crises intersecting with each other. The legitimacy of gender quotas are also debated, but any positive gender equality measure receives a lot of backlash across the world today, and women in politics are targeted in these violent smear campaigns, mostly taking place online. And then there's another question then. Do you need the representation of women's interests, or do you need the inclusion of gendered interests or feminist interests? Not all women are gender equality advocates, right? In fact, this is a note from an European Parliament briefing. Research notes that increasing popularity of right-wing populist parties among women in Europe, maybe you talked about this yesterday, I don't know. What could be the reasons for this? Well, for one, gender does not equal gender equality consciousness, right? It doesn't go that way. Consciousness is something else. 2, these parties satisfies women practical interests, such as social policies focused on family, cash transfers to mothers, flexible work. 3, such parties integrate gender equality in their anti-migration agenda in certain countries, portraying themselves as the true defenders of women's rights against misogynist attitudes, quote unquote, important from outside Europe. Jasper Poirs conceptualizes this as femonationalism or homonationalism. Also, populist anti-elitist rhetoric also attracts women who are dissatisfied with the economic situation in the country. If you look at the history of egalitarian constitutionalism, Ruth Rubio Marin has this very powerful trajectory, looking at a move from exclusionary, where law fails to consider gender equality, to inclusionary perspectives, and then thirdly to participatory, right, with this parity democracy discourse, and finally to transformative perspectives, where the domestic sphere is reinterpreted, where there's radical subversion of gender order, focus on intersectionality, challenges to heteronormativity. So what we see today across the world is that 3 and 4 participatory and transformative elements of gender equality policy receive a lot of backlash, and sometimes constitutional erosions, re-entrenchment of traditional gender and family roles. So we see a mobilization against gender equality and sexual rights unfolding simultaneously across contexts. Their targets might change, but there is a common denominator, mostly sexual minorities, reproductive rights, gender education, gender mainstreaming, positive measures such as the Istanbul Convention. And the Istanbul Convention, the attacks on the Istanbul Convention have become, I would say, an epitome of this anti-gender and democratic backsliding reaction. The pronounced reasons, of course, vary across contexts, but usually the definition of gender as socially constructed, encompassing migrant women, right? Attacks on national sovereignty is offered as a justification, but also because the convention offers a holistic perspective to violence and structural inequality, like most EU policy does, and expects measures from states to address it, like its 4 pillars. I would also add that the backlash is not simply reactionary, it's also very productive in the sense that producing knowledge on gender, co-opting women's rights language, like emphasizing family rights, the rights of the families to be protected, co-opting gender policy and NGOs, and an increasing emphasis on the family over the individual, I think, is something to be considered, especially in the context of constitutionalism and the social contract. If you look at these family marches, discourse of family rights, 2025 has been announced as the family year in Turkey. So we see a lot of pro-natalist politics, pro-separate spheres discourses, women's caregiving role emphasized. Neoliberal economy can't have women left out of the workforce, of course, but then, you can create precarious laborers from women, flexible work, working from home. So all of this, I would say, is very critical to think in terms of the social contract, where you look at the liberal tradition, it's the individual, not the family, right? If you look at the Republican tradition, the community maybe, still the citizen, but not parochial as the family. So I would say, in the face of all of this, participation is important, and political participation is not just parliamentary, right? It's much more broader than that. And inclusive social contract means voice, as the project name suggested, express. So it's digital, in social movements, in civil society, in these democratic innovations like citizen forums, or within organizations itself. So I finish with a quote from Walby, and I'll take questions from you, or feedback, or any comments. Walby says, practices and institutions that might re-gender democracy extend wider than parliaments and executives, including legal institutions, the public sphere, organized civil society, and coalitions, sometimes triangles of feminists across state and civil society. Each of these institutions has a different scale or reach and is differently gendered, so their relative significance in the overall ecology of decision-making has significance for the emergent macro gender regime. So thank you very much for listening to me. It was a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a bit difficult for me because I don't know, where you're from, what you're studying. So I'm not sure if I could, balance the material, right? So any questions, anything you want to add, any examples that you want to give, or, just in general, when you think about gender and the EU social contract, what comes to your mind, maybe? That would be an opening question. Antoni, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I am trying, because I'm in my mobile phone. I don't really know how it works. So
okay.
I'm going to ask. Yes, I did it. But I would like to give the floor to some of the other assistants if they want to ask before. I have some questions. But well, I will take profit that I raised the hand first. So I have, it's a question and a comment that probably you and I will have already talked about. So you were saying, and I agree, and I think that the doctrine also says so, that the gender definition is socially constructed, right? So the epistemological consideration of genders is something which is socially constructed. Some doctrine, and I'm thinking especially in our in one of our, I think it's in advisory board members, is Gülru, that she's proposing the abolition of the genders as such. Do you think that from all the different stages that you were mentioning, especially the one of transformative, is this a valid aim, a valid goal, or do you think it is not feasible? Or so the way would be to tackle the socially construct by denying the social construction of this concept, which has been epistemologically used to discriminate. So that would be my question. Thank you very much. And again, I'm sorry, because I knew how to raise the hand and I did it immediately.
Thank you, Antoni. Should I go ahead, or are we collecting questions? Okay.
As you prefer.
What should I mean by abolishment of gender? I answered your question with a question, but
yes. So that's yes. Well, it's not me meaning, but what there is a reference that you cannot target people by different genders. So there won't be male-female distinction, but you will have, let's say, an holistic epistemological concept which englobes everybody. Let's say persona, for example. So there will be this distinguishing between genders. not in a positive, not in a affirmative action, but everybody will be, we will have, let's say, no gender. That's what they meant.
Is, you know,
not only the social contract, but in our society. So the goal is to end with the gender, not gender discrimination, but the gender itself. So by end of gender, you will also end, of course, as a consequence, the discrimination, right? Because there is no genders.
Okay.
So I'm a skeptic. That's my but I would like to listen to your point, your opinion, of course.
But you might have an ultimate goal of ending discrimination based on gender and saying that gender should have no relevance in the determination of policies and the distribution of resources, right? And if you frame abolishment of gender as such, that might be the end goal. But to go there, right, you need sometimes, not just, as I said, these three different typologies, gender inclusivity, gender neutrality, gender specificity, and transformed. I don't think, these three can exist by themselves, right? You need all of them together, because in certain cases that would end up in gender blindness and not addressing injustices. So you can have an ultimate end goal of abolishing gender but again, I would say, it wouldn't be a generalized idea, but you have to look at different institutional contexts and different policy areas to answer that question, right? In certain aspects, you need gender specificity so that you create justice. Like when you're addressing care labor, for instance, or when you're addressing systematic injustices such as, gender-based violence.
I think Alberto has raised the hand. I think so.
Yes,
and
someone
else.
And we have another Seleshi, I think.
Yes, yes. But I'm okay talking after the other people if they want.
Thank you. I have one question. This is a very nice presentation, and so my concern is the role of social media. Social media platforms to promote this gender equality, especially some guys post stereotypes against this gender equality. So how do you measure the role of social media platforms in order to promote gender equality?
How do we measure the role of social media in promoting inequality or equality?
Equality.
So, whether they're effective or not, is that what you mean?
Yeah. Whether they are effective, because there's some stereotypes are still in social media against this gender equality.
Okay. Well, there is a lot of research being done on social media. I'm not myself a researcher who conducts work on social media, but there are ways to measure it, right? So you can, do, for instance, I don't know, look at it. Well, it is difficult to look at, whether social media creates impact or not on people's perceptions. There are ways to measure it. But I'm sorry, I'm not really familiar with that research methodology. Because there's also the issue of echo bubbles on social media, right? Sometimes, something that looks like, that looks like taking a lot of space on social media does not really create that much of a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Alberto, you had a question.
Yes, actually, it was kind of a continuation of the question of Antoni, or not, I wouldn't say a reply, but link it to it. But you already kind of addressed it. So, but it was related to systemic injustices, and I think that for me that's the key point, right? We cannot be gender blind because society is not and has not been gender blind. There are many forms of underground discriminations that are not fully visible, but they are systemic. But my question also relates to that. I'm wondering, that I always wonder how we can address these kind of underground forms of discrimination when sometimes they colored the political discourse. I mean, for example, what you mentioned of women supporting extreme right-wing parties and so on, they may be related with these forms of systemic discrimination, cultural discrimination, or just these ideas that are so present in our society that we don't even question. But we have to do it through the political process, of course. So how you do that? How you, let's say it in a politically incorrect way, how you fight against your own political group or political consensus in that regard? Thank you.
I don't see it as fighting against your own political group, because I think that, you know, being a woman and having a gender perspective are two different things, right? There's no, you know, direct connection there. You can have a pro-feminist man and you can have a very, you know, anti-feminist one, but there is a connection. Not that there is, of course, there is a connection that comes from experience of certain systematic injustices, right? And then, you know, the creation of awareness is, I think, the only way, like showing that, you know, gender-based violence happens because gender inequality, and it's not just, you know, any form of violence in society. It is a form of violence that stems from a deeply entrenched structural inequalities, and that all of these things are connected, right? The unequal share of care responsibility is connected to lower pay, and, you know, lower pay is connected to, you know, not working at all,
of course,
and looking at children at home. So I think showing these connections and gender mainstreaming, to answer your question, you know, including a gender perspective into politics, I think, and, you know, creating awareness on this systematic issue is critical. I don't know
if I can follow up just very briefly, my question is, I understand that we need to create awareness, but how you can make campaigns to create awareness when you have an increasingly populist movement that has convinced a very significant part of the population? It's true that not necessarily only women, but some of them women, that that's actually not necessary, but negative. And then they fight against wokeism and so on. How we can do this within our democratic society?
Well, it's difficult. That's, you know, but I didn't want to end with a difficult note. So I said, you know, we need to think about it more broadly, not just, you know, about political participation in the parliament, but that's why I ended with Walby's quote. We need to think about, you know, institutions. For instance, a lot of people do a lot of effective work within institutions, like in municipalities, in the corporate sector, in companies, in universities, on digital media, in the public sphere. Also, I would add, you know, cross-sector alliances are critical, like alliances between politics and, you know, different elements of the public sphere. I think, you know, that would be the only way. Creating these, what Walby calls triangles or cross-sectional alliances, would be key to create solidarity against this whole backlash.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I also assume a human rights approach, right? Because at the end of the day, this is human rights. So there are some values and institutions that cannot be challenged even by democratic institutions, because they are established in the Human Rights Declaration.
Hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so let me first of all thank Gülru Teşekkürler for your very nice presentation.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Now, well, you know, I wanted to jump to your conversation, the last points, but it's not I don't want to be protagonist. It's not my call. So now the floor is for Alberto, that he's going to be talking about climate change. So Alberto, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thanks again, Gülru. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present here. I'm going to first present my screen. Let's see. And now, okay. So can you see everything? Yes, I cannot see you. So I assume that you can see everything. Let me know if there is no problem. Okay, so indeed, I am presenting on climate change. My name is Alberto BARRIO. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Copenhagen, a part of the EXPRESS² project and of the department Klima. So good morning. Thank you for being here. My presentation focuses on how climate change challenges our existing social contract and how we can adapt it to address this challenge effectively. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, even though it is an environmental issue, of course, but it goes further than that. It disrupts economics, it disrupts societies, and it disrupts governance structures. And most importantly, it exposes the limitations of our current system, and it demands innovative solutions. So that's what I am going to explore in this presentation. So this slide presents a very brief structure of the presentation in a stupid animation. So first of all, I'm going to analyze how the combination of an outdated vision of the social contract and the challenge of climate change produce a series of challenges, and how these challenges are processed through our existing EU policies or approaches, but also by social protection policies, particularly at national level, and how these policies require certain adaptations in order to do this function properly. So, first of all, I will start with why, in my opinion, the current vision that some actors or in which our laws are currently based of the social contract is outdated. Again, I have to highlight, it's not that the social contract is outdated, of course, but that the vision of the social contract in which the laws are based are sometimes outdated. And this is in part because of the specific historical moment in which these laws were designed. In that time, it was Fordism and industrialism, and therefore the vision of the social contract at that time was different than right now. So the first problem is that this social contract, this vision of the social contract, is typically unsustainable. It relies on fossil fuel-driven economic growth, and this growth usually exceeds planetary boundaries and therefore contributes to climate breakdown. Second, it has a narrow focus. It prioritizes economic metrics like GDP over broader aspects of human development, such as work-life balance, civic engagement, and long-term sustainability. It's also, and following up on the previous excellent presentation, is exclusionary. Historically, it has marginalized women, indigenous people, informal workers, colonized people, and other excluded communities, failing to provide equitable benefits for all involved. And finally, it's and this is the main focus of this presentation, is not adapted to the new realities, it's outdated. It has not adapted to modern challenges like, of course, climate change, privatization, austerity measures, or shifting labor markets, characterized by gig work and automatization. So, so after covering this outdated vision of the social contract, let's now cover the second aspect that results in the challenges, if you remember the short animation, climate change, and obviously the focus of this presentation. So, climate change have a series of impacts. Here we see them. They are many. I don't have the time, unfortunately, to cover them all today, but very briefly, some of them are direct effects. So extreme weather events like floods, like droughts, like wildfires, and they are obviously becoming more frequent and severe. I don't have to say that unfortunately, to our Spanish colleagues with the flood in Valencia recently. There is also obviously rising sea levels, which threaten coastal communities, and there are also increasing temperatures that disrupt, among other things, agriculture and biodiversity. All these aspects result, among other things, in the risk of climate migration and worsening working conditions, among many other social impacts. And second of all, there are also obviously impacts of environmental policies, policies designed to combat the extension of climate change and the augmentation of climate change, if we can say that. And some of them include coal phase-outs. They are obviously necessary for decarbonization, but often result in significant job losses in fossil fuel-dependent sectors. Pollution taxes, which are effective in reducing emissions, but they may disproportionately affect low-income households by increasing their living cost. And extraction for renewables, a topic that is not that often perhaps discussed, but the reality is that the demand for materials like lithium creates environmental justice concerns in mining regions, both in Europe and outside Europe. So all of these obviously create, among other things, job displacement, greater cost of living. So these negative impacts, they obviously impact everybody, but they especially impact vulnerable groups. And here it's where mitigation and adaptation policies come in. These mitigations policies and adaptation policies are designed particularly to prevent the extension of these vulnerable impacts, especially to vulnerable groups. And today there are many. I don't have again the time to cover all of them. There is safe and rescue, aid to companies. There is also environmental protection and labor protection measures, including, for example, the recent directive on corporate sustainability due diligence that requires company to identify, mitigate, and manage the adverse social and environmental effects resulting from their operations and their global value chains. Also, the recent directive on corporate sustainability reporting directive as well as labor laws at national level. But today, I'm particularly focusing on EU approaches and especially also on social protection measures. Because perhaps they are not as much discussed, and they are obviously a key tool to address the effects of climate change. I will talk about that in a second. But also, in order to do that function, they require adaptations. So now, I'm going to talk about some examples of these impacts and the actions taken by the EU to mitigate them. So, the EU has implemented several programs to address these challenges, but they come with limitations. First challenge is social and geographical inequalities. So obviously climate impacts are unevenly distributed across regions and demographics. This is partly because of the distribution of industries, also because of the distribution of the extraction and so on. Among other mechanisms established by the EU, the main one is the Just Transition Mechanism. It's an European Green Deal initiative. It provides 150 billion between the periods of 2021 and 2027 to support regions transitioning away from fossil fuels. It includes the Just Transition Fund, which is almost 20 billion, InvestEU and Public Sector Loan Facility, and it requires territorial plans approved by the EU to access the funds. These funds may include actions like economic diversification, worker retraining, clean energy projects, and so on. Second issue is job losses in polluting industries, partly related with the previous aspect, and because of that, partly addressed by the same program, the Just Transition Mechanism. The third issue is energy poverty, which is part, obviously, of a bigger problem, which is a rising risk of poverty among vulnerable populations. But energy poverty is because of the rising energy cost, disproportionately affect vulnerable households. And in order to combat this challenge, the EU has created the Social Climate Fund, which is part of the EU's Fit for 55 package, and it mobilized 86.7 billion for the period between 2026 and 2032 to assist vulnerable households and micro enterprises affected by carbon pricing. But member states need to submit climate plans detailing measures like energy efficiency, clean mobility, temporary income support, and so on. But again, it's primarily focused, obviously, on energy poverty. Or the poverty resulting from rising carbon pricing. And finally, extreme weather events. We have mentioned them already. Increased natural disasters cause widespread damage and displace communities. There are several funds that address this. I don't have the time to cover all of them. It includes the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which invests in resilient infrastructure and early warning system. And the EU Solidarity Fund, which has been established in 2002 and provides financial aid for major natural disasters exceeding 3 billion euros in damages or 0.5 of the GDP. Eligible countries must apply within 12 weeks of the disaster, and the grants cover, among other things, emergency infrastructure restoration, temporary housing, cleanup operations, and so on. However, all these approaches have several challenges, among others, administrative complexity, lack of local capacity, lack of funds often. Usually, especially in the Social Climate Fund, there is not a well-done definition of what the vulnerable groups specifically are. And finally, focus on, in the case of extreme weather events, focus on infrastructure reconstruction and focus on short-term measures and not long-term resilience. Okay, so this is primarily the approach by the EU. As you can see, they are typically characterized by the transfer of funds, primarily, both to EU countries and to EU countries to provide to companies. And these funds are both covered by public funds, but also sometimes they use also private funding. Okay, now, Why social protection? Now I'm moving on to cover social protection. And why using social protection as an adaptation and mitigation tool? Why not just using these instruments that I have referred to and others similar to them at national level? Well, there are many reasons. I want to focus in two groups of them. First, it's value-driven reasons. And that's based on the nature of social security. Let's say that we have prepared ourselves for this, we social security people, for our lives. This is what social security is for. Social security is for reacting to social risks and to long-term preparedness to risks. And because of that, social security is based on values that are particularly useful for the just transition, including equity, solidarity, and redistribution, both in benefits and cost allocation. And these are the values that are necessary to address the uneven impact of climate change. So first is the correct tool for the job, let's say that way, in most cases, or in some cases. But second, there are practical reasons. First, it already have an existing institutional framework, including social dialogue. Second, it has been proven to be extremely useful to improve social perception of climate reforms. We have seen this in many countries, like in France with the demonstration of the yellow vest, that unfortunately sometimes climate reforms have been faced with negative public perceptions, in part because of these uneven effects into vulnerable groups and vulnerable communities, like rural communities. And if the climate measures are accompanied by social protection, it has been proven that it helps improving this public reception. And finally, and this is a very simple reason, but it's an important one, and is that decent living allows for long-term prevention, which is cheaper than addressing emergencies. This has been proven in healthcare costs, but it also, for example, in some countries, they have seen that if they provide income allocation, cash transfers, and continuous support to populations that are in areas at risk, like, for example, areas at risk of flood, then these populations can prepare themselves for the risk. They are the first one who want to prepare, but if they do not have the income and the resources to do so, then they cannot do so. So by ensuring that they have a decent living, they can be sooner and better prepared for what the risk that may come. Okay, so these are just a few examples of why social protection should be used. And now, what does exist right now under social protection systems to address the effects of climate change? So first of all, obviously, I have to address the traditional social protection systems that already exist and schemes. So this includes conditional, so for example, unemployment benefits to health workers displaced by green transitions, health programs addressing risks related to climate-related diseases, also sick pay for when workers may become ill due to climate-related risks, and so on. Obviously, because these programs already address some of the impacts that climate change results on, they are the first, let's say, this first barrier of defense in many cases. And second, there has been a series of new programs created first, and those addressing what we can call new risk. So these can be both disaster preparedness, and there are interesting examples. For example, in Mexico, Mexico require to do training when a person is receiving cash transfers, like unemployment. They need to do some training, and part of this training needs to be in disaster preparedness. And also Spain, in a recent new law, it requires employers to train their employees as part of the health and safety programs on disaster preparedness. Also Spain, in the same law, created an interesting program which requires paid climate leave. This means sick pay for when, no, sorry, it means leave for when workers are not allowed, not able to work because of climate-related contingencies like extreme weather events and so on. And there are also green transition employment and training programs. These are programs focused on promoting green employment in some way or green training. So this includes, for example, green training in Belgium, on the Netherlands for persons that are receiving unemployment benefits, and also the promotion of green jobs. For example, in Belgium provides wage replacement for fossil fuel workers transitioning to offshore wind jobs. France requires 15% of social integration programs, contracts, which is some form of kind of unemployment contracts, contracts to reinsert persons in the employment market to involve green sectors. And the Netherlands, it aims that at least 30% of its welfare recipients needs to be employed in climate jobs by 2025. Of course, all these programs are not perfect. There have been some issues detected, like, for example, in Belgium, some of the programs promoting the transfer to green jobs of unemployed persons have been detected to not always fulfill. Okay. Well, we will try to survive. Well, well, I don't think that you can see me, but we will try to do it. Okay, so maybe just give me a second. I'm gonna adjust.
Yes, don't worry. Take your time. No problem.
Sorry about this. Never happened before.
No,
but,
no problem. No worries. No worries. No worries. This thing happens. No worries.
Well, technology. If you have, well, I don't have many slides left, but.
And we don't have too much time either, because I wanted to allocate some time for questions and answers. I'm sure some people will be interested in asking you questions about climate change and your presentation, which was so far very, very nice. So, but if you want to conclude with some slides, it's up to you.
Just 1 second. Just at least so you can see me. 1 second.
Yes, here you are.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm gonna see if, let's see. Okay. Now we are back. Again, my apologies. Okay, so sorry about that. So as I was saying, these are not completely free of controversy. That there have been issues, for example, in Belgium concerning whether these jobs fulfill the decent jobs criteria established by the ILO. And most importantly, and this is my last slide, is that even though social protection is obviously an extremely useful tool to address some aspects of climate change, it does require adaptation in order to do this properly. Otherwise, we risk not only that social protection will not do this job properly, but also we risk putting us at risk social protection as a whole. So first of all, we need additional financing. And here I really need to mention the Council recommendation on fair transition, which is an extremely interesting recommendation by the European Union of last 2023, I believe. And they, 2022, something like that. But the main thing is that in that recommendation, they require actually, they recommend additional financing for these kind of actions. Because of course, if you have a greater risk and new risk, then you need more money and more resources in order to address these challenges. And this additional financing could include, for example, environmental taxes, reallocation of resources. And I want to mention, for example, a proposal by the French Senate in which it recommends to cover part of the cost of climate-related diseases with a 0.2 tax on polluting industries. So that could be a way of financing, at least in part, this new cost. Second is important, and I haven't addressed that much because we don't have a space for everything, but it's important to decouple social security from economic growth. It's not only that social security or social protection needs to address the impacts of climate change, but also social protection needs to not contribute to climate change. And therefore, here, this is a huge problem for social security because it's traditionally linked to economic growth in its financing. It requires social security contributions, which in turn are linked to employment. also to population growth in the case of pension in some countries. In other countries, like those that have funded systems, it requires growth in the stock market, like for example, for Nordic countries. So we will need to reassess and adapt completely the financing systems of social security so then they are not a tool for contributing to climate change. And third, there needs to be a shift towards non-nomination discourses. This is an entirely separate discussion. I recommend an article by Anja Eleveld in the European Social Security Journal that addressed this. But the main idea is that social security has been traditionally focused on this idea of responsibility, and of course this is important. But now with climate change, we need to reconsider that and go back to values like solidarity and basic subsistence while empowering communities within ecological limits, and particularly to try to seek the non-domination of communities. Again, this follows theories like those of Philippe Petit and so on. And finally, international approaches. Because this is a global problem, it requires global solutions. And this means, among other things, international regulation, including through EU actions. So these are some of the adaptations necessary. So in conclusion, the current system is, in my opinion, outdated. It's unsustainable, narrow in focus, it's exclusionary, and is not well adapted to current labor market. Climate change exacerbates these issues. There are some EU-level initiatives that try to solve some of these problems. However, they may not be enough, and they are limited both in scope and funds. And therefore, we need new solutions, more solutions, and that needs to include, among other things, social protection initiatives, both at national level and also at EU level and international level. And this social protection initiative cannot use the exact, let's say, handbook that we have for social protection until now. There needs to be some adaptations of social protection, and I think that that's enough for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I stop sharing. And I don't know if I have the time to questions because of this catastrophe. I don't know how much time I am following. Also, I wasn't able to see my screen, so I don't know. Again, my apologies for the thing.
No, you don't need to apologize. We saw the screen. It was not a catastrophe. So I really enjoyed. There's some people talking, so I don't know. So maybe we have. I would like to have some questions because I think that the presentation, in my opinion, was a very nice one, very illustrative. So if there is some questions, I would like to take them. If not, I will ask you again. I don't want to capitalize on the role of asking everybody, right? But if not, so is any question? Someone wants to ask something on this very interesting topic, or I will jump in. Very brief, because otherwise we will step in the time of the next presentation. So I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I mean, Alejandro has a question, so I will prefer to give the floor to Alejandro.
No, go ahead, Antoni.
Go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah,
yes, Alejandro.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, really interesting presentation, Alberto. Really enjoyed. I was wondering because of everything that is happening right now in the US. How that maybe another main concern will be to raise more awareness of how to educate people on how climate change is important on these topics. Otherwise, if we have suddenly a radical right, or yes, a more right-leaning party on the European Parliament or in Europe in general, maybe all these climate change policies could be I don't know, reenacted, or will be dismissed completely, and we will lose everything, all the steps that are going little by little. So I don't know, what is your impression? How can we raise more awareness? I mean, there was like for example, what happened in Valencia was partly created by climate change. So how to connect that and how to fight this climate change doesn't assist discourses? What do you think about it?
Yes, Thank you very much. Indeed, I am also extremely concerned about the extension of populism. I think, well, it's one of the greatest dangers, of course. And that's also the reason why I asked that question to the previous speaker, and it's very much linked to your question. I mean, yes, it's great to know all of this, but what happens if the public don't believe in this? Well, I think that the answer is kind of similar. First of all, it's a human rights approach. So these are, in many instances, cases of human rights, and therefore they are not up to discussion. People have a right to health, people have a right of a decent living, of dignity, and so on, and therefore they need to be protected. Now, what's the best way of doing so? I think that these are technical questions. Many times I argue that social security and social protection is one of the best tools to do so because of technical reasons that I have addressed. And I really hope that this is not really up to discussion. It's true that unfortunately it is. We have arrived to a point in which we are even discussing facts, right? But it really shouldn't be. This is not about values. Again, it's a human rights thing. It shouldn't be up to discussion. And then it's the best way of achieving this. And then I think that social security is the best way of doing so. But because we are living in a democracy, and this democracy, unfortunately, is full of populism, we need to go back to awareness. And I think that it goes back to what we were discussing before. These presentations and these projects are important to transmit this. Again, I think that, as I was saying, social protection has proven quite useful in part of doing that. Because when you tell people, yes, we are addressing some negative effects, you may not believe in it or not, but we have to address it. And now, but we are going to protect you when doing so. It has been proven that the people are more okay of that. If they know that they are going to get protection, unemployment protection, other forms of protection, support, they are more open. So I think that here social protection has a huge role, but it needs to be together, and also dialogue in order to establish democracy, in order to establish the best approaches to this and so on. Again, I think that this project is a very good example of how to do it properly, hopefully. So I don't know if I answered your question. We can go further into it if you want to, but this is part of my answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We still have 4 minutes, so my question was also somehow related with the one of Alejandro. I'm going to be a little bit more polemic because otherwise I get bored.
Yes.
So when you are mentioning social protection, it's the relation with my question relation with the one of Alejandro is it can be understood that you're putting a new elephant in the room. No?
A new well of what? Sorry?
Elephant. I mean, you have already an elephant in the room, which is, let's say, climate change. And now you put a new one, which will be social protection, which is related and probably is also what Alejandro meant with not only the US, but, you know, the reaction to climate change, etc., liberalism. But my question would be a little bit more, let's say, as I say, polemic. Don't you think that someone can tell you, well, Alberto, but what you're saying is somehow it can be a bourgeois perspective. Why? Because you are prioritizing social protection and not thinking in a more global sense, first of the eradication of poverty, right? If you think on Thomas Pogge, if you think in Amartya Sen and other, the first goal will be eradication of poverty, which will be previous to social protection. Unless you think, well, you know, eradication of poverty is within the concept of social protection. Yes, it can be, but someone will tell you, well, but you need to prioritize even within the different concepts that can be labeled under the concept of social protection, right? So that will be a little bit, as I said, I want to be polemic in order to have fun, right?
Yes. Shall I start answering? Okay.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you very much. I love polemics, so and I hope that we can continue this discussion another time, perhaps with a beer. Well, yes, it is definitely part of the problem. But look, okay. So first of all, yeah, I always have this problem. I should probably have started defining social protection, but the problem is that I always have to do it, and at some points I get tired of it. I use a very broad concept of social protection, mostly following the one used by the European Union. both in the treaty and in recent instruments like the recommendation on access to social protection and the Council recommendation on minimum income. So I do include fight against poverty as a huge part of social protection. But for me, social protection covers both social security, so social insurance, social assistance, and then even other programs that may be even broader, including perhaps housing. So it's kind of a representation of what's the role of welfare state. But yes, it's true that within that huge part of programs, sometimes I think that we have to use them all, obviously. And I think that there has been an artificial separation between them sometimes. Like there is this guilt related with social assistance or these non-contributory social protection programs. And that's part of what I wanted to say with the non-domination discourses. Like we have to fight it back. First of all, because it's not fair. It wasn't fair. It was never fair. People that are poor are not usually because of their fault or not necessarily. It's the result of many aspects, including globalization. But right now with climate change, I think that we have an even bigger reason to argue that it's not their fault. Even more, it's actually the fault of, in part, polluting industries, rich countries. It's a combination of factors. So we can even say that there is now even a responsibility to cover these people. So now the barrier between social assistance and social insurance in many cases should be separated. And these requirements, this conditionality of many programs for social assistance in some ways should be questioned. And particularly the guilt. So that's part of the discussion. In my opinion, there needs to be a separation between them. But also, just like we have to do everything, in some instances, I think, again, it's part of what Virginia was saying, it depends on the context. And it's different tools for different jobs. So sometimes we need to address issues with social insurance. Other times we will need to address it more with social assistance. I don't think it's a bourgeois argument, though. I mean, social protection is not a bourgeois argument. If you see historically, I mean, it's actually a workers' argument. I mean, it's what, at least in Europe, and again, I do have to admit that my presentation is, for good or bad, primarily based on analysis performed in Europe. I do think that protection against climate change events needs to be, or the discussion with climate change needs to be in part accompanied by support to developing countries because it's a global issue. And that's part of what I was saying with international action. But many of the actions I am addressing, they relate to European countries and how to manage the risk that happens here. So in Europe, at least, I do not think it's a bourgeois discussion. I do not think it's part of our system, and it should be defended as such. This is part of us. This is part of the European Union. This is part of the European social contract, and we shouldn't forget it. I hope that I can can keep talking. I mean,
no. I mean, I fully agree with you. That's the problem. So I mean, but I wanted to pose that it is true that the question was polemic in the sense of use bourgeois, in the sense of Eurocentric, when we're talking about a global problem that needs to face global solutions, as you already mentioned, right? So, well, we will, of course, have time, inshallah, to discuss about this with the beers, wines, and other things, hopefully. It will be really my pleasure. But now I want to thank you very much for your presentation. It was, as I said, very, very, very interesting, and I learned a lot of things. So I really appreciate that, and it would be we will have good opportunities to discuss not only this, but all the things related with the social contract. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe a last thing before we leave. I mean, in this presentation, I do have focus on social protection, but please do not forget that there are many other elements of the social contract, obviously, including, as I said, labor aspects of it and so on. So this is a huge discussion that needs to be addressed with many, many different approaches. And I think that it's a discussion like many. And I think that this is what I love about this project, and is that all the issues that we are addressing, they are interconnected. My discussion is related also with populism, is related with gender issues. I haven't addressed it that much, but part of the non-domination discourses relate to valuing unpaid work, also because it's productive work that is not necessarily related with economic growth, and that's a kind of jobs that we have to promote, and it's reproductive, socially reproductive work. So that's part of what I see social security going, which obviously have a huge gender perspective. So everything is related. So that's why I think that this is a very interesting project. Thank you very much for being part of it.
You're welcome. Actually, we have a work package exclusively dealing with all these connections between the different disruptive elements.
I know,
Thank
and
you
I'm
very
looking
much.
forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So now the floor is for the next speaker, which is Alejandro. And yes, Alejandro, I don't want to steal your time. You can jump in, and the floor is all yours.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Alejandro Tirado. Right now I'm working at the CSIC, at the Spanish National Research Center, but I also cooperating with the Carlos III University. And what I'm going to present today is about mistrust in this lovely winter school. I'm waiting for Juan to connect if he can do it, but otherwise I'm gonna present by myself. Feel free to stop me whenever you want or you need. So wait and see if I can. Yes. So I'm a political scientist, so my approach will be more like an empirical approach to the what is trust and how trust has evolved during these 20 last years in the European Union. So the first thing is what is trust and what is mistrust, and I want to have a conceptual differentiation between two topics which are really connected. The first of one, what is trust? Trust is the support in political institutions. In this case, we are focusing on the European Union, so it's the support people have for the European Union in general. Of course, when people lose trust in politics or in general, this could lead to a crisis of representative democracy that happens all the time in many countries. That first we find a lack of trust in a country, and then we found certain crises of representative democracies, but time to time, maybe they come back as the previous levels. What are the problems that happen with why people lose trust? But there are many things. First of all, is corruption, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, lack of responsiveness. So if people see that the elites are corrupt or they don't listen to the demands, all these things create or diminish political trust. But as I said, before moving on, I want to differentiate between two things. What is trust and euroscepticism, that a word that you may heard a lot of times. When we talk about euroscepticism, we refer to a complete opposition to the European Union or to the project of the European Union. So we heard after Brexit, this euroscepticism has declined a little bit, but before Brexit, there were a lot of political leaders that were completely against the European Union. They want to either destroy the European Union or they want to be an independent country. We have seen this with the UK, which was the perfect example of this. But also we have, as I have the photo over there, different leaders, Viktor Orbán, the president of Hungary, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the radical right in France, or Wilders, the leader of the radical right in Netherlands, that they want to dismantle the European Union because they think it's a failed project that doesn't have that, endangers the national sovereignty. That is one thing, that a position complete to the project of the European Union. And the other thing is mistrusting the European Union. It's more like people, you don't trust or you don't, sorry for using trust. Mistrust, when we talk about mistrust, is more like you think the performance or the institutions that are working in the European Union are not working as they should, or as you think they should. Of course, both things are connected, both concepts are connected, as I said before, but it's different to talk about trust in the European Union because maybe you don't trust in the European Parliament, or you don't trust in the European the Commission, or in certain political actors in the European Union. But the idea of the European Union, you still support it. So it's not the European Union itself; it's the institutions and its performance. So, well, this is basically how in political science, how we measure trust in the European Union. In most cases, we measure it with trust in the European Parliament. Of course, this has a lot of methodological concerns because the European Union is not only the European Parliament, but as they don't have much question in the public opinion to ask about trust, this is the proxy that we use in most cases. So what happened with trust in the European Parliament in the last years is the fact that citizens, European citizens in general, has lost the trust in the European Union after the crisis in 2008. So in almost all countries, as you can see there, I put a lot of references. A lot of people have lost their trust in the European Union and the institutional arrangement in the European Union. So I here show several maps of based on a survey on the European Social Survey, which is a survey that is administered in many, as you can see, European countries. Sometimes some countries appear and disappear because we have data, we don't have data. So if we don't have data, for example, Italy, I don't show it in these maps. But as you can see, in general, we go from 2002, in which almost all countries were green, yellow, to a more darker and darker yellow. And the most striking, obviously, the most striking finding is obviously Greece, in which in 2010, after everything that happened with the economic crisis, we're in the worst moment of the European Union trust. So why this happens? Again, austerity measures and trick interventions like absolutely created political environment in Europe that created mistrust in the European Union as a political actor. Second, the lack of trust in national government is really connected to the lack of trust in the European Union. So if people don't trust, or people doesn't trust in their national governments, mostly they don't like or they don't trust as well the European Union leaders. Also, and something that is related with what Alberto said before, is not the same being a high-class citizen than being a low-class citizen. So after the austerity measures were implemented, citizens from lower position in the social ladder were the one who lost more trust because of their deprivation of economic deprivation after the crisis. And finally, there was some regional inequality, which is large to explain, but basically there were some regions which face a really high economic growth, and others that didn't face this economic growth, and that create a regional inequality that leads to a mistrust in the European Union based on the European funds and so on. So what I'm going to show you now is what is the current state of the public trust in the European Parliament. Second, which groups based on by age, gender, education, and common ideology show the greatest trust in the European Union. Third, we are focusing on which type of policies prefer people to be administered by the European Union, which one they prefer to be done by national governments. And finally, as we were talking before, how the rise of far-right parties is connected with mistrust in the European Parliament. So first of all, again, as I tell you before, I'm going to show you some graphs, some plots. I'm going to explain everything, of course, but I don't want you to be scared because of all the information, because I will try to summarize what it shows. So this is the first figure here is the evolution of trust levels in the European Parliament by country. as you can see, it comes from 2002 till almost now to 2020. 5 years ago already, but because of COVID, time passes really fast. So as you can see, many countries, there is a red line, which is the economic crisis. After the crisis, many countries declined their trust in the European Union, but now they recovered, or they're almost at the same point as it was before. That happens with Spain, that happens with France, that happened with Germany, that was more or less stable. Also Greece, and Poland, Portugal, Hungary. So in general, after the shock of the crisis, now trust has become a resilient attribute to all these countries. So people actually trust now more in the European Union than it was before in most countries, not in all countries, because we have, for example, Cyprus, in which it was a complete mess after the crisis, and the trust in the European Union has declined at all. Second, which people, what kind of people prefer or have higher trust in the European Union? And I have this plot, this figure. So to interpret this, imagine the 0 line means that it has no effect, and the small planes X-wing, how to call it, planes are the coefficients. So if they are behind the 0 line, they have a negative effect or a negative relationship. If they are above the 0 line, or if they are in the right, it means it has a positive effect. So what we found is the fact that age has a negative effect. So the more we raise the age, the lower the trust in the European Parliament. So basically, young people trust more in the European Union, and older people trust less in the European Union. So maybe this could be because of socialization in the European Union and the European values, but in general, that is what we found. Also, we find that right-leaning people tend to be more trustful of the European Union Parliament compared to the left-wing people, left-wing voters, to say it in a way. I said gender, but in this case, it's women. Women are more likely to trust in the European Parliament, and also people who are high educated and have higher income are the ones who show higher levels of trust in the European Parliament. So this just an image of what we found right now. Here is who should manage the European Union or other governments. So as you can see, we have several policies: agriculture, aid to the developing country, defense, environmental protection, and so on and so forth. And people are asked who you think should manage these issues. And of course, the European Union is people trust more that the European Union should manage almost all issues, but especially something that was related before with Alberto is environmental protection, agriculture, and immigration. Those are the 3 key topics that people prefer to be managed by the European Union rather than national or regional government or other international things. Why? As Alberto said before, global problems need global solutions, so people prefer to have these issues defended or managed by the European government. Lastly, but not least important, the radical right vote and trust in the European Parliament. So in the x-axis, in the one which is in the lower part, is the level of trust in the European Parliament from 1 to 10. And on the y-axis, which is in the top, on the vertical one, is the predicted probability of voting a radical right-wing party. So as you can see, these are like percentages. So it's 4%, 6%, 8%, 10%, 12%. The less you trust the European Parliament, the more likely you are to vote for radical right. So of course, these 2 things are correlated, strongly correlated, because once you have more or less a good trust in the European Parliament, do you have like a good you are less likely to vote for the radical right, but people who doesn't trust the European Parliament are more likely to vote for these parties. So in general, this is the preliminary conclusions that we found. Trust in the European Parliament and other institutions has returned to pre-2008 economic crisis level, but our question is how has evolved after the wake of the COVID-19? What happened after COVID-19? Trust in the European Union is higher among young people, women, individuals with higher education, income levels, and those with right-wing political views, which is interesting to see, because in the other side, we have men, we have older people, lower education, lower income levels, and left-wing people or left-wing political views who show less trust in the European Union. Finally, Europeans tend to place more trust in the European Union in order to manage certain issues like environmental protection, agriculture, and migration, and trust in the European Union is negatively correlated or has a negative association with support for far-right political parties. And that will be it. Thank you so much, and open to your questions, ideas, and that's it.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm gonna turn on my camera. Well, thank you very much for this very nice presentation. As I did before, we like to first offer the floor to the assistants if they have questions. If this is not the case, I will jump in, trying to. So Alberto has raised the hand. Please, Alberto, you can do your question, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Excellent presentation. Very, very interesting. Extremely important, as we discussed before. I was just wondering, specifically on the graph that you saw on the different, the trust in different countries in the European Union. I was wondering whether you measured, because for example, in Denmark, there is the interesting aspect that even though it seems people do trust the European Union, they do have a lot of hesitations on the role of the European Union in many aspects, and they are actually, at least the Danish government, very much against intervention of the European Union in aspects like, for example, social rules. And they for example, they have challenged the recent directive on minimum wage, which we just recently read the Opinion General's opinion, the Pocket General opinion. So I was just wondering how that can be that countries that do trust the European Union, however, do not want the intervention of the European Union. How do you take that into account, if you did, in your surveys? And in general, how, because it's a very complex discussion. I assume that you probably have developed a lot on the concept of trust. And I understand that here, perhaps we don't have a lot of the space to do so, but I was just wondering, because I understand it's a complex concept that includes just literal trust, but also understanding of the role of an institution. I can trust an institution that I believe that should be very small, and I still trust it. But of course, it's not a similar trust to somebody who believes that the role of the European Union must be huge, must be extremely important, right? It's a very different kind of trust. So, so yeah, I was just wondering if you have measured what people understand the role of the institution before measuring the trust. And thank you again very much for the intervention. It was excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much. So basically, we haven't, because we haven't done the survey yet, but we want to do that. So this survey is not our survey. This is not the survey of the project. This is the survey of the European Social Survey, which is an open access database that we can work on that. And the problem is that, of course, they have they have little questions about the European Union. They have only few ones, and their barometer is the same. They don't have many questions. They have questions about the European Union, but not the way we wanted to conceptualize trust. As you said, the conceptualization of trust is quite difficult, and maybe you have a lot of trust in the European Union, but maybe you don't want to be involved in certain areas, or in health or education. It depends. So when we once we do the survey, we will take all these things into account to, of course, not just measure trust as how you trust as how to say, like an ambiguous idea, more like a specific idea in which areas, how exactly is the way you think about the European Union, how to measure the social contract is one of the main challenges that we can have in the survey, I think, related with trust. I mean.
Okay, thank you. So
thank you very much.
I need to turn on my camera. So is there another question or not? So see, I can jump in. I had a comment, or maybe it's not a question, it's a comment, and I would like to be interested. What's your point of view on that? So you are referring in the slides that you were showing us that the voters of the far right or Eurosceptic parties, they have less trust of the institutions of the European Union, right? That's apparently something which is very logical, right? That's why they are Eurosceptics. So the question that I'm asking is, then why when they see, I'm asking because I don't know if there is some correlation. When they vote these political parties and they see how they behave in Europe, because then some of these parties that you cannot generalize either, because now you see that there are splits even within the far right and the Eurosceptic political parties in the European Parliament. So when they see that they are not confronting, that they are not really acting against the European Union, but they are within the frame of the European Union, within the narratives of the European Union. They are saying that they want to change the European Union, but they don't want to exit of the European Union. Don't you think that this can have an affectation on the trust of the individuals to these political parties? So it can be, don't you think it can be somehow a paradox?
Yeah,
that would be my question. I don't know if you understood what I wanted to say.
Yeah. So how to say this? So most people the problem here is to find the causation. No, what comes first? Is the lack of trust that makes people vote for the radical right, or is the appearance of radical right who makes people the lack of trust? So maybe we should focus on that. But my idea is the following. My argument will be the following: people have those who has lower trust in those who rise their the trust in the European Union, little by little they say, maybe I should vote for another party. Maybe I should vote for a radical right party. And then they move to the radical right party. And once they are in the government, they are in institutions, they realize that they don't make actually a change. That is already studied, but not in the European Union, but in national and regional governments. In Italy, for example, the trust of the trust, yes, and the trust in these parties declines after they are in government. So people tend to like less their supporters like them less. So they say, you're not actually addressing all the issues that you were saying that you were going to address. You are not challenging the actors that you were saying that you were going to address. And also now, based on the European Union, I think the problem is the aftermath of the Brexit. So we have a lot of Eurosceptic parties, but I think they changed their positions about the European Union. They say now, I think we don't want to leave. We want to change this, or we want to maintain this. We want the economic part, but we don't want the social part. So also asking about that or thinking about that, it will be interesting to focus, because that's my impression about everything that is happening right now with the Eurosceptic parties.
Thank you very much for your answer. Is there another? Yes, Alberto has another question. Please, Alberto, jump in.
Only if there is nobody else. I mean, I can keep asking and asking. This is a fascinating topic, and as we discussed, this is something that we all need for our topic. So,
me too. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
But go ahead.
We all have an Alejandro in our office. But yes, so I was curious about other thing when you talk about the impact of the economic crisis on trust, which of course it makes a lot of sense, also based on the answer by the European Union. But I was wondering, going further, do you think that there is a connection between trust and what now became, for example, called the shocks as part of the shock doctrine? I'm wondering, when a society receives some kind of shock, it can be economic crisis, it can be COVID, it can be artificial shocks, or it can be real shocks. I mean, I assume that has an impact on trust. I'm wondering if, I mean, there is obviously a relationship also with how the institution approach the shock, but I think that it's just the nature of the shocks that will affect the trust of the people, no matter how the institution approach it, because they don't like shocks, and when shocks happen, they react against institutions. So I'm wondering also if you are integrating that into your, I assume so, but how you're integrating that into your assessment, and how we can do it again, because I mean, part of the trust, the institution needs to earn it, but there is another part that I believe that it's just contextual, and then that's the difficult part, because you cannot fully control the context. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're completely right. The nature of the crisis is the one who mark the variation in trust. So, for example, as we were saying before, the austerity measures impacted so much low-income and low-educated people who were then the ones who voted for the radical right-wing parties. That happened with the economic crisis, but what happened with the COVID crisis? Actually, I don't have it here, but I want to study it more. I'm having some articles about it. Is quite the opposite. With the COVID crisis, all the public institutions, because of social protection, they raise the level of trust. National governments, regional governments, European governments. Why? Because the nature of this crisis was equal for everyone. Wasn't equal for everyone because, of course, the COVID-19, if you are women, you're probably more likely to take care of your elders, and if they have COVID, it's a complete mess. Of course, this crisis doesn't hit everyone in the same level, but in general, it did. So people in general needed the protection of the state, and the state should be the provider of certain social protection, social policies to protect them in this context of crisis. So what I'm going to say, what I wanted to say is that the nature of the crisis matters a lot. And in the moment of the economic crisis, it was the decisions that happens. It was a more endogenous problem, and the COVID-19 was more an exogenous problem. Because the economic crisis was, what should we do? We are facing a crisis. National governments are against the European Union. They face different ideas, different contexts. But with COVID-19, you need to solve that crisis because it's a exogenous crisis and it's a health crisis, and you need the state to protect you. It's not, the free market should regulate itself or something like that, or maybe you should intervene in the market. It's not the same, rather than, no, we have to intervene. We cannot leave this health problem to spread and see what happens. So I think focusing on this type of things, or focusing, for example, of what happened in Valencia, or earthquake, or floodings in Germany, focusing on different crises where this type of crisis mediates the correlation with trust or not. I don't know if I answered your question, if you want to.
Yes, you did, of course. I mean, again, I can keep talking, but I don't know if I am completely sure about what you said at the differentiation of crisis. I agree that the nature of the crisis matters, but I don't know if there is that much difference, because, I mean, with COVID, countries decided not to react. I mean, look at the US during Trump. I mean, they denied the crisis for as long as they could. And also the Netherlands, where I was residing at the time, they waited so long, and the first reaction was, let people get immunized. So we don't have to intervene. I mean, I definitely believe, and unfortunately with climate crisis, I can see some governments saying, well, this is individual responsibility. I mean, it shouldn't be, but unfortunately, I can see that direction being taken by some. So, and so what I am learning from your discussion, from what you just said, is that when governments intervene in a crisis, trust rises. And when governments do not intervene, trust decreases. I mean, if I will have to simplify it very much. Okay. Yeah. Now I'm also wondering, what happens when some actors do not want the trust, even governmental actors? But that's a different discussion. I mean, let's have it. Maybe one last thing, but this is something, just because you are here, let's talk at some point, because as you can see in my presentation, there is definitely a connection between your topic and mine, especially on the role. I also presented the role of social protection to gain trust. And I really like it what you just said on the COVID crisis, but we are seeing that with climate change. I mean, that's something that we see very much. So that's definitely something that it's a point of intersection between our topics. Okay, thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, I completely agree. Of course, there are things in between all our presentation and work. So I'm really looking forward to do more things.
Okay. So thank you very much, Alejandro, for this very wonderful presentation. Muchísimas gracias. I cannot. I mean, you were mentioning the Dana of Valencia, and I think the facts are saying that you are right, because one, you know, the inaction of the I don't know if you're wrong or right, but maybe it's a case to consider how the inaction of the government of the autonomous community affected the trust or not of the people voting there, because the last poll said that the people will still vote in the party despite the horrible way that they manage on the data. So this is maybe things that we need to consider. I don't know if it's related with your conclusion or the conclusion that Alberto was mentioning. So maybe it's also an input to consider. To end the day, the conference of today, I again thank you very much to all the participants for the wonderful presentations. It was really a pleasure. I will see you, some of you, tomorrow, hopefully, and others I will see you in Brussels or in Madrid or in other places. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.